I'm Mohammed Amin. I'm a new member of the Liberal Democrats. I joined in October, although I was a Liberal back in the early 1980s for about a year and a half. And my main role is to handle the technology for today's event, while Nasser Butt will be chairing it. However, Nasser's just getting himself organised, so I will be provisionally chairing slightly as well. And I just want to set out the ground rules. Apart from Layla and Nasser and myself, please could everybody else stay muted unless the event chair actually asks you to speak. We've had quite a few questions in advance, and to give Layla as much time answering as possible, Nasser is going to ask those questions rather than calling upon individual people to ask their own question. Now, Zoom has a chat function, and I would like you to use that to write down additional questions that occur to you during the meeting, or if you want to be called upon to speak, mention that in the chat, because then when we do have time to ask people to ask questions directly, we can know that you actually want to ask. And we're allocating the time roughly 20 minutes for Kashmir and Palestine, 20 minutes for the Liberal Democrat Black Action Group / Committee, and 40 minutes for general Muslim and other related questions. But to start, I'd like to ask Layla for any preliminary comments and remarks that she has. So if she could unmute and we can get going.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much, Mohammed. Thank you, Nasser, when he comes in. And thank you to you all for being here today. And I just want to say a massive thank you also to, I understand it's Friends of Kashmir, but also Friends of Palestine, and some Black Lives Matter groups are also attending. And I really appreciate the chance to talk to you, because events like this hold the party to account. They inspire new ideas. They show us where we are, but also how much further we have to go. And as leader, I am ready to face up to tackling the systemic inequalities that we have seen in our own party, but also my motivation comes from wanting to tackle those inequalities in wider society. My own background is a diverse one. My mother is Palestinian. My father was a diplomat for the European Union. As a result of his job, we lived in many countries, including Ethiopia, Jamaica, Jordan, and Greece. And as the first MP of Palestinian heritage, I have championed a two-state solution for Israel-Palestine. I introduced the bill twice now to recognize Palestine as a state in of its own right. As a constituency MP, and I'm the MP of family members of Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, I was the only MP who managed to get an apology from Boris Johnson for his unforgivable blunder that resulted in her spending longer in incarceration than was necessary. And I've sat on panels of cross-party MPs who took Saudi Arabian government to task over its treatment of civil liberties campaigners in their own country. But my politics has stemmed from my love of being a physics teacher. And that is primarily my experience outside of politics. I became a teacher because I wanted to bring out the best in every child. And I became politicized as I recognized that there are huge inequalities in society that stop people from fully accessing those opportunities to make the best out of their own lives. And so I became an MP because I wanted to change the inequality that I saw in our country, in my community. And I want to be your leader because I want to see change in inequality that I see in the party itself, across our country, but also across the world. But to do that with any credibility, we have to first get our own house in order so that we can champion our universal liberal values. And I've heard this call of change coming from all parts of our party across the United Kingdom. And we are in a very difficult place. We're bumping along the road. The latest poll had us again at 6%. And meanwhile, this disastrous government is attempting to take apart our country piece by piece. And I do apologize in advance for having to go at 4 o'clock because I need to go do Channel 4 to hold them to account over their disastrous handling of the A-level results. And I predict this is just going to get worse over the next week or so. But there shows that there is a place for our party now more than ever. We need the right strategy. We need the right message, and we need a leader that people can really believe in again, that's got credibility, who can communicate a progressive vision that appeals to a broad base of moderate voters. And this is how I won my constituency. I overturned a 10,000 Tory majority and we won. And then I increased it to the best ever result in this seat's history last time. And we also now run the Vale of Whitehorse District Council. I know how to win, and I want us to replicate these successes nationally. For too long, we have been explaining the past rather than campaigning for the future. And with a renewed vision, a step change in how we operate, and a leader who can rebuild trust with the electorate and cut through in the media, we can do better. We need together to reinvigorate our party, hold the government to account, and win again. And I am the leader to do that. And I look forward to hearing your questions today, not just in this session, but moving forward as well. My leadership style is one that is collaborative. And in my view, the best leaders always involve as many voices as possible in their own decision-making. So I thank you again for this opportunity. And I hope that this is the beginning of a long and fruitful relationship with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Layla. Just let me make some remarks, Layla, just for your information and also for the information of the members who've joined here. This is, of course, we intended to run it in a similar way to the one we ran with Ed last week. But I understand you have to leave at 4 o'clock. That gives us 60 minutes. Now, which means that I will try and push as many as questions we put through to Ed last week. But depending on how concise the answers are, we may be able to get through.
That's our trade-off, Nasser. I will be brief.
Yeah.
I will be concise and brief.
That's great. That's great. And I'm just trying to make the others understand that too, so they don't feel too disappointed with their expectations. Now, the other, of course, good thing behind that is that we've got the West Midlands Equalities hustings tomorrow with both of you. So if we don't have all our questions here, members can take some of those questions to the hustings there tomorrow. So hopefully, but for your information, all of our questions are from BME members of the party. The three main groups who have pushed for these hustings have been the Muslims Forum, of which I'm a chair. The Friends of Kashmir, Mahmoud Faiz is the chair of that group. And Juliet is recently started the group called the Black Lives Matter. So there's a lot of energy in these groups on the issues that are there. So all of our, even if I'm asking a question about national state affairs, I'm looking at it from that prism, if you like, and where the questions are going to be coming from. Let me start with international affairs, in particular relevance to human rights.
Yeah.
And I know you've been engaged with us because I'm on the Friends of Palestine group as well, and you've been engaged, and we've had a special session with you recently on that too. So I'm not going to emphasize too much about Palestine because I know where you stand, and you answer these questions quite regularly. Let me ask you the general question, which is about United Nations ability to deal with human rights issues that have been arising for some time. We've got issues not just in Palestine now, we've got India, we've got Kashmir, we've got Northwest China, Uyghur Muslims facing that, you've got Myanmar issue, ethnic cleansing, and there are others around the world and big countries who cannot be challenged by other countries. And then you are down to UN people look to UN as a solution, and UN, you got, somebody pointed out 19 resolutions on Kashmir, none of them enforced, similar with Palestine, and seems to, it's not fit for the purpose. What do you think, given what has been happening UN, in relation to UN, in relation to expectation of peoples to come to their rescues at a large scale ethnic cleansing, where do you think is the solution for that?
Well, Nasser, I sense from your question a frustration that I share.
Yes.
And I've shared for a very long time those of us who follow international politics, and I should say that's where I began in politics, for all intents and purposes, around the dinner table, we were talking about the big players in the world, yes, Israel, Palestine, but also in whichever country we were in, it was very often looking across at what America was doing, what China is doing. Those big issues in the world then have their repercussions on the ground in many of the countries that I was living in. And people look to the United Nations as a way through these problems. Let's remind ourselves, of course, these great liberal institutions set up primarily in the wake of world wars to try and broker peace and understanding among the countries of the world. And unfortunately, they aren't working in the way that they should. So yes, they need reform. It's one of the reasons why I think it is so regrettable that we are leaving the European Union, because alone, Britain was never going to be able to do this, at least not now. From the position we are now as a medium-sized country, we have to be working with other people. But by leaving the European Union, we lost clout. You know, UK PLC is diminished on the world stage as a result of the way that we are conducting our own foreign policy. And one of the worst things that we're doing of all is cozying up to Trump, who is disrespected by so many of these institutions. He also disrespects them himself. He riles against them. And by choosing him over making the case with other Western democracies who want peace, who want those international liberal values, then it makes the chances of us leading on this that much more difficult. But there is still things we can do. And yes, the UN needs reform, the Security Council needs reform. I've always advocated that, you know, we should try and have a more robust rotation system, that if there are also things that are on the ground, those big assembly moments that then pass, it should be linked to action. There should be a way that that actually translates into action on the ground. But the way that the world works now is it does look like it will need countries like the UK to step up. And in certain situations, and I would argue Kashmir is one, but also if you look at the Balfour Declaration and the way that this country was involved in the creation of the mess in Israel-Palestine, I think we have a moral obligation to lead in a way that we haven't done for a very long time. And we can do that. We can bring people round the tables. We can hold our own multilateral and bilateral meetings here in the UK, bringing in different partners. We need to improve the caliber of the FCO and DFID. We shouldn't be rolling it into one. Every time we do something like this, it diminishes our ability to exert any kind of power on the world stage. And so I am in despair, not just about the UN, but also the British position in order to affect this right now. But it's why I'm a Lib Dem, because this is what we are advocating for.
And what would you do as a leader? What would you, I mean, to be realistic, what we can do as leader of a small party in the UK, I mean, given that, but you can still shout and about and
absolutely
push. What would you do in terms of reforming? How do you think it can be done?
Well, I think you don't do it alone. One of the things that I do very well in the House, and I've demonstrated this by leading the inquiry right now that's happening on coronavirus, is working cross-party. We have to accept where we are. You know, we are the fourth party in Parliament. And when we are talking about the big issues, there's two ways that you can influence it. One is to raise these issues in the media, to use those opportunities. For what it's worth, I think Alistair Carmichael has been doing an incredibly excellent job on a number of different issues, but in particular Hong Kong and the Uyghurs. And we have in many ways led that conversation. And that is partly by calling for changes to be made in the House, leading cross-party groups, but also using the media wisely. And I think that is the role of the Lib Dem leader, is when issues like this come along, to not shy away from them, but to actively talk about them. And I have a background that makes me very comfortable talking about international affairs, where I'm very, very happy to make the liberal argument, because ultimately everything that we do, any time that we talk about human rights abuses, you know, taking place in Jammu and Kashmir, Uyghurs, wherever it is, we are explaining to people why we are liberals. We are explaining to people that they deserve peace, that self-determination matters, that safety is something that we should not compromise on. And every time we talk about it, it's positive for the Liberal Democrat brand, if you like. If you think back to
Right.
when
I'm going to,
well,
just
let
to
me just
help you.
make this one point,
Yes.
Nasser.
Yeah.
When did we do well in polls? Is when we were talking about international affairs. It was Iraq. You know, it's when we talk about this that people can see who we are. So I will not be shying away from it.
Good, good. Because my assessment is that really we don't really have any human rights activist leaders shining out in the country from the Liberal Democrats for a long time. And I always mention Eric Avebury as a champion, where cross-party, cross communities, people knew that he's a champion of human rights regardless. So Liberal Democrats and Labour used to do that in the 70s and 80s, but we don't seem to have any. Let me put this to you, because I put this to Ed as well. Donald Trump, on behalf of US as a president, announced sanctions against China, forgetting about his other reasons for doing that, but for Uyghur, for the Muslims in Uyghur, he specified it. And we as Britain has always, more often than not, very rare that we haven't piggybacked on a foreign policy with our special relations partner. But Britain is quiet, has not said anything about sanctions, hasn't joined. What should Britain be doing under your leadership?
I mean, when it comes to Trump, my general instinct is to not follow this man. You know, and there's a question about, to what extent does a special relationship exist? What does it give us? Do we want to, in general, cozy up to America as opposed to other people? You know, Iraq was all about that, was about that special relationship. But Trump, frankly, is not America. He may well be the American president, but he is not the America that we used to know. And every time that you have this government cozying up to him because they want a trade deal or whatever it is that they want out of it, I worry. And I worry not just for our own credibility as a country, I worry for the world. Because what Trump is helping to do, and he is playing right into Putin's hands as well. You know, these strong men, what they want is chaos. They thrive in chaos. And where you have chaos, that is when you get an increase in human rights abuses. That is when you start to see the decrease of international free trade, one of the cornerstones of our liberal tradition. And that protectionist approach, that populist, nationalistic approach, is one that we don't believe in. So we have to stand up to Trump.
So even if this is the only hope the Uyghur Muslims have got out of the international, nobody is prepared to stand up to China. You only have Russia or America who can't stand up to China. You got America going up, and you are saying just because of Donald Trump's personality and his approach, you would actually shy away from one good thing that could come out of this sanctions against China for the Uyghur Muslims, and you say because of Trump we won't touch it.
No, you're putting words in my mouth. That's not what I said.
I'm asking a question,
yeah,
but
that's not what I said.
Okay.
So I absolutely think that we need to be taking China to task. And when the Huawei issue arose and Britain decided that it didn't want Huawei as part of our 5G network, I said that is the right thing to do. But it's the right thing to do, but they did it for the wrong reasons. They didn't do it for human rights reasons. They did it because Trump has and he has had a long-standing agenda against China, and it's a trade war, and it's nothing to do with human rights. Trump is not standing up for human rights. Trump is standing up for Trump's own self-interest in a year where he is looking for trouble because he knows that that's going to help his poll ratings because he's going to have an election in December.
Okay, let's move on. I mean, I don't want to spend any time on Trump if I can help it as well. But I think it's important. I'll tell you why it's also important, because I had discussions with some of the other members. And you mentioned in your leadership a lot of reforms that need to be done, the way the leaders go to work as a result of our last general election, the way it ended up, and dissatisfaction by the members and so forth. One thing people remind me is that in Parliament chaos on Brexit, there was opportunity for opposition parties to basically try and call out the whole thing. And you were there. One thing that came out was where the Joe Swinson continuously pushed out a line that no way, Jeremy Corbyn, we will not do this, we can't trust it. And she actually threw away the opportunity what we could have had with alliance parties. So the notion was that, are we doing the same sort of thing here because of Trump, the one opportunity with one human rights? And this is the question that was relayed back to me as a result of this answer. Do you feel that is with your leadership, you will look at things differently to the way Joe sort of dealt with Labour Party at the time?
Yeah. So at the time, and look, we were seeing it on the ground in places, even here in Oxford, West and Abingdon, Labour supporters who weren't supporting Corbyn. You know, the man was toxic. And certainly in a lot of the seats that we were standing against the Tories, he
I
cost
understand
us
that.
those
I
seats.
understand
But,
about the feeling about, I'm talking about the way Joe basically took Corbyn as a reason for basically losing the opportunities of opposition coalitions to work together at the end.
okay, yeah, so I was just coming to that. But my general view in politics is to be non-tribal. What I care about the most is the outcome. What I care about the most is, why are you doing it? And if that intrinsic motivation is there, then everything else will fall into place. So if our motivation was to stop Brexit, then the right thing to do was to work as best we could cross-party to achieve that. Now, the way we did it, I think, has been shown to have been problematic. And it was a top-down approach. This was the problem, Nasser, was we are a party that says ardently, we believe in decentralization, we believe in grassroots organization, we believe in a bottom-up approach. And in Oxford, West and Abingdon, I worked with the Greens. They stood aside for me and they campaigned for me. And so did Labour members here. They campaigned for me. And I didn't, that's not by accident. That took years to organize. And that took building trust between the parties. And that took understanding our differences. And it's not about amalgamation, but it's about appreciating that actually sometimes when you have a common foe, my enemy's enemy is my friend, right? We worked together, and that's how we de-seated the Conservatives in my seat. So I do believe in cross-party working. I thought that at the last election, the way that Joe was actively campaigning against Corbyn was just unhelpful. The tone should have been more disappointment. That's the way that I felt we should have approached it. I'm just disappointed in Corbyn for the way that he isn't on board with Brexit, the way he hasn't dealt with anti-Semitism in his own party, whatever it was. But actually, what we didn't do, what we absolutely failed to do, and the General Election Review is very clear about this, is that alongside any of that, we did not put across the positive liberal case for ourselves. And that was always the problem at the last election. We lost a sense of who we were. So now, where are we? Well, yes, we're going to have to work with other parties. I've been very clear about this.
I've got time constraint. I'm trying to move things along. Sorry about that, but it's sort of, we both created the situation. So I'm trying to help you by cutting you, and so I could go on to the next question, if that's all right, Layla.
Sure.
One more question on human rights is, it's been a year since India annexed what you call Kashmir last year.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened within the party, there were two things. One, that we had the EU team and we had, Shafak, who were very keen, and he led the campaign on at European level to speak against India and so forth. And then there's the Westminster team, both the House of Lords and Commons, who appeared that they were not unaware, they were unaware, and they're too busy with Brexit, and they didn't really understand what was going on in India. What is your understanding of Kashmir now, and what do you think is the party policy ought to be on what's happened to Kashmir since last year?
Yeah. So I mean, yes, it was August, wasn't it? In
Yes.
2019.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to be perfectly honest with you, Nasser, it wasn't until I think you and I had a conversation about this, and it was over text, that I became aware of it. And you're right to point out that, you know, there was a huge amount of upheaval going on at the time, and it hasn't been since the last few months that I've begun to understand it. And I should start by saying, on these kinds of matters, it is imperative that the parliamentary party and the leader actively engages with the groups who are closest to this to understand the issues, because I know that they are complex and I know that they deserve to understand everything about them. But my understanding of where we are now is that there is huge human rights and civil liberties implications for what's going on, and that it is unacceptable. And we need to do more to stand up for this. I'm not aware of when this has been raised in the Commons. I am aware of where it was raised in the Lords. And we, as a party, I personally think we've dropped the ball. So what would I like to see? Well, first of all, in terms of developing the line, I feel quite uncomfortable saying this is what it should be, but I know that these are the principles I would base it on. It would have to be perhaps about self-determination, certainly about peace, certainly about ensuring that the UN is allowed to come in. One of the things that the UN does do well is when it investigates human rights abuses, it does shine a light on what's going on the ground. So that is the call that I would start to make. But I do think that we need to be engaging positively in this in a way that we haven't yet. And I fully accept that that has not yet happened. And I can tell you that as leader, that is something I would seek to do.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Just for your information before I move on, there was a motion put in emergency last year, which didn't get a hearing in the stage, if you like. There was another motion put in for spring conference and didn't get accepted. But I think the party, whoever is dealing with policy, they've taken what we called for and listed it there as what the party policy be based on that. But I would suggest Mahmoud, who is on this group, the chair of, is to organize a meeting with the leader after the elections, so that it can update and try and so the Westminster Party has a policy to work with.
Agreed. Absolutely agreed.
Which is not there. So let me, I was going to, as I said before, I'm just cutting short, and I've taken out the question on Palestine, which I asked Ed, but you've answered that so many times. So I'm
hopeful people know my position, but if you're not, please write to me.
Yes. Well, tomorrow they can challenge you. Tomorrow is another equalities agenda. Now, I'm going to move on to some of the domestic policies. The very first one, the very big one, and of course, and I don't need to rehearse the background, you know, that what COVID has highlighted is that the people at the bottom who lift the country's basic services, public services, by and large number are people from minority groups, from immigration directly as employees or people from this country. They're on the law on the income, they are law on the care of protection of employment, they're on the 0-hour contracts, and all these things have come to highlight the inequality, the Britain that is unequal, Britain that the poverty at that level, despite people working long hours, poverty exists at that level. And they're the front line when disease comes, because they are the front people providing the service. Now that's going to require some sort of major Liberal Democrat policy development. What's your views on what you're going to do in terms of solving that unequal puzzle?
Oh, well, I mean, as I think I explained in my opening remarks, inequalities in our country is what is my driving force. It's my passion, it's my anger, it's my fire, and it's what I'm here to do. As to the specifics of coronavirus, that's partly why I was interested and put myself forward to chair this inquiry into coronavirus that we're leading right now through recess. We have not stopped. Every week we are hearing evidence. We are going to have special evidence sessions specifically to talk about the impact on Black and Asian minority ethnic communities, because it has been so widespread. In my own work right at the beginning of the pandemic, and we will all remember this, you know, when you saw the frontline workers and the nurses and the doctors who were passing away, people were going, but it's obvious that there is something happening here. And I felt, you know, at least let's give those families something to fall back on. So some people may not be aware of this, but this was a huge win for the party. I started calls for a coronavirus compensation scheme for those NHS and frontline workers who pass away on the front line of COVID. Just like in the armed forces, if you pass away in the line of duty, your family should have that financial stability. And it worked. I got on board with this campaign. I started it. There were 70 MPs and peers who came on board. We were all over the news, but it really hit home when we teamed up with an unlikely bedfellow, which is the Daily Express newspaper. Now, for those of you who know anything about the Daily Express newspaper, it doesn't tend to love Liberal Democrats. In fact, usually quite the opposite. But they contacted me in this case and said, we love this campaign, we want to push it with you. And they credited me and the party. It was on its front pages for 5 days. They used their one question at the number 10 briefing to ask about it. And as of now, it exists, that there is a scheme. Those families, those bereaved families, get £60,000 more than they would have done before. And I continue to push this to be increased so that it includes frontline other workers, you know, teachers and delivery drivers and TfL workers. And that will disproportionately help those families. But, surely what we should be aiming for is that they aren't dying in the first place. And when we saw a lack of transparency from the government for their own review, it broke my heart. And that is what I'm aiming to be pushing as part of this inquiry. We need this to be well understood.
Have you got any positive action plans of how Britain is going to resolve the economy? I mean, is there something policy or campaign for future as a leader you will pursue in order to reduce that inequality that's come to light?
It has to be built in to what we're doing now. You might have noted that there was a book that I pulled together before the leadership election began called Build Back Better. That's a phrase, by the way, that I borrowed. It's not my phrase, it's from the UN, in fact. And it is an intent to, when there is a time of crisis, build back in a way that is more resilient as a society than you were before the crisis. And what has happened with coronavirus is this exposing of inequality. And in my 3 E's in my campaign, I talk about education, for obvious reasons perhaps, the environment, which is actually a key part of how we get this economy going again. Some of you might have seen, I was on Newsnight yesterday, but after me was a woman from the Grantham Institute who was talking about how, if you want to supercharge the economy at this time, actually to do it in a way that's green is the smart thing to do, not just the right thing to do. But the third thing that I talk about, my 3rd E, is the economy. And what I talk about is putting well-being at the heart of the economy. And that is a catchphrase that essentially means what we need to do is to build in things that tackle inequality from the grassroots up. It means investing in our public services. It means taking a long view when you are investing. It means making sure that local authorities have the money that they need in order to deliver services, high quality services on the ground, a very bottom-up liberal approach. And when we do this, and when you look at the evidence, because I am a scientist, and above all else, what I want to know is anything that I'm advocating is backed up by evidence. When you do this, that is when you start to see inequalities fall. Under the Tory government, it is increasing. And so there is a really positive story that the Liberal Democrats should be talking about, tackling inequalities at the heart of our economic policy. And that would completely change how we invested in this country.
Okay. Would you, I mean, I'm just picking a few questions from members. Would you consider putting KPIs across the public sector so that people can see representation all the way to the board and the bottom, because there seems to be inequality there, discrimination there. One ex-councillor here in Sutton, nurse, she says what she's seeing now is people being promoted as a result of the money coming in to directorship, but they're all white. And the people who are at the below that grade 5 are just haven't got the resources to even cover the patients they've got. So this is NHS as a result of all that. So just an anecdote example, but you know, KPIs across, at the moment, the large organizations, private organizations have that. Would you push for KPIs across the public sector?
Yeah, I already have, in fact. So as part of the leadership campaign right early on, I actually spoke about having KPIs as part of the FTSE 350. So not the, you know, the 350, which is a much broader group to capture. And you need to be much more transparent across the whole of the public sector as well. And the reason you do this is because inequality is inbuilt at every stage. It's also why I've spoken about changing our curriculum. Because unless you tackle these inequalities right at the point of school, unless people understand the way that society has inbuilt inequality in it, and it disproportionately affects people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, then they won't appreciate that they are part of the problem. And it causes immense shame, and so it should. But we also have to recognize that political leadership is needed at this point. We need to show people that we are taking this seriously. And I have made it a key plank of my campaign all the way through, not just in business, not just in public sector, but also for the party itself, which I'm sure we'll come to, and also in my work as education spokesperson. Every single part of society is affected by this. We need answers for every single part of society.
Okay. Let's look at the same sort of situation within the Liberal Democrats. There's a great anger amongst the WhatsApp groups of the three organizations in terms of lack of representation, which is, and I think we all know that. But the problem is, I think the crux of it is that previous leaders at the time of general elections and the time of leadership selections, they've all made great promises, but nothing's been delivered. Mm-hmm. And we've had reports and nothing's been implemented. How would your leadership be any different from in terms of equality of opportunity and representation of BMA members in the party?
Well, Nasser, bluntly, I would be the first leader with any kind of lived experience of this. Because I've had it, and I have it, by the way, in this leadership election. There are members who have decided that I'm too risky to vote for because I'm Palestinian. I pause there for effect, but just so you can take it in. Because I am Palestinian, just on that reason, they've decided to not vote for me, or they're questioning voting for me, because their assumption is that therefore I must be anti-Israel. Without even looking at my record, without even seeing that I have made articles in the Jewish Chronicle where they compliment me for the way that I deal with these issues. And in fact, I'm a positive role model. And so that inbuilt discrimination, other leaders may see it. The difference is I feel it. And at every step of the way that I have risen in this party, or indeed in any other part of my life, it's sat with me and I will not forget it. And so when you talk about changes of culture that are needed, the last part of the Older Dice review, the hardest part arguably to implement, then I know what it means to walk into a room and people make assumptions about you based on nothing to do with the content of your character and based on things that you didn't choose. And so I will then use that experience, but also my experience outside of Westminster. Westminster and parties in general are very slow to change. If you think about how quickly organizations change, political parties are very bad at it. And they follow that, Westminster culture. One thing
what are the three things you would do once you become a leader to resolve this?
So in terms of changing the culture, actually, Nasser, it starts with the leader's office. You have to ensure that there is a diversity of views that is represented in your office, not just necessarily the people you employ. There's never enough money to employ all the people you need to, but to make sure that there are regular opportunities to engage. The easy thing to do has to be engaged with the right people. My approach is collaborative. It's how I work. I tend to seek opinions. I tend to seek diverse opinions. If I have everyone telling me the same thing, I know something is wrong. I'm not seeking enough different views. So that is a key part of what I offer. Secondly, though, I think we need to challenge local parties. There is a big issue of culture in local parties that needs to change. Many of them driven by ignorance. They don't appreciate how their own culture is off-putting to many members who come from a different type of background. We need to roll out training. And in my 5-point plan for the party, training is a really important part of it. Not just unconscious bias training, but also how to positively engage with communities that they might not have ever engaged with before. There needs to be a spreading of best practice. But the third, and you mentioned KPIs, I actually do think that we should be measuring this in every single local party. And the challenge that I set to local parties is a very simple question. Do you represent, or are you representative of the people you want to represent? Okay, so in your constituency, if you've got populations who are, you know, very ethnically diverse, and you have an all-white campaign team who is suddenly deciding the most important issue for my community is X, well, do you have the right information in front of you? Of course you don't. So we have to be measuring this. We have to experience it for ourselves. We have to have the right people around our tables challenging us, and we have to welcome that challenge. That is the change of culture that is necessary. It's one I live every day of my life. It's how I operate. So that's how it'll come from the top, but it's not going to work unless it also is a bottom-up approach at the same time.
Thanks. Now, one of the things that is a problem is that there's a lot of, as I said, a lot of promises. That's we dealt with that issue. There's also reports being done and just left unimplemented. Okay, even the latest one, which everybody agrees, Alderdas report was very good. If we only could implement that, how would you go about implementing that? Because there's a general acceptability that the things in there are workable. How would you try and implement that?
Well, in my own experience of any kind of change process, and this is going to be a change process that, you know, we need root and branch change in our party right now. And it's not just on this issue. You know, if there was ever a moment for change, it is now. If you like, we are in a rebuild. If we were a company, we are changing the CEO, we are going to now set off on a new direction. This is the time to change. And you have to put resource into it. Because unless you put resource into it, and there's two types of resource. One, in the context of politics, is, you know, where does the leader's eye look? What priorities do they have? And, you know, I am asking you to hold me to account for my words, but this will be a priority for me. As I say, not just because it's the right thing to say to win votes, but because it's something I care deeply about. But also, we need to be recruiting new donors into the party from a background that is sensitive to this, who want to help with this. If you look at the major party donors to our party, they're not that diverse either. And that's one of the things that I also bring, is a new set of donors into communities that haven't hitherto given to the Liberal Democrats, who would be sympathetic to changing the face, quite literally, of our politics, who want to put resource into hiring officers, into spreading best practice. All of this takes time, all of it takes money, and it includes the leader deciding that they're going to fundraise for this. So money and intent.
Okay. If we look at the electoral position, when we last reached the Labour heartlands and won seats was on the back of Iraq. And we had large-scale Muslim vote councillors shifting to us, you know, and that doesn't seem to be there anymore, because that reversed when we joined the coalition government. People went back in droves, etc. What do you think? How are we going to reach the Labour heartland? Because the Labour heartlands always have enough marginal vote of BME population there to swing things. Mm-hmm. What do you think in future we could do to actually swing that kind of vote to us?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we need to appreciate that our electoral position right now means we have to, like good chess players, not just focus on the next election, but also the one after that. So at the next election, it is true that we are second in mainly conservative facing seats. And there are some who are saying we just need to focus on those. But that would then ignore people who are living in Labour heartland councils, particularly in the north, but also in London, where they've got complacent Labour councils. It makes it very hard to fight them if you're only fighting on one flank. And then if you look ahead, let's say we're successful in the 30, 40, 50 seats or whatever, most of which are Tory facing next time. Let's say Keir Starmer somehow pulls together something and he is the PM at the next election. At that point, we know from our own history, it is very likely that we'll be starting to look to win over Labour facing seats. So when I developed my message, when I sought to answer the question, what's going wrong? The first places I went were Labour facing areas. I went to Leeds and I went to Sheffield. And I then went to Devon and Cornwall, and I then went to Wales. And what I wanted to develop was a message that is broad enough to appeal to both moderate conservative voters, but also is appealing to Labour voters as well, because that broad coalition is what we're looking for. And that is what I have done. So education, emblematic of our liberal values, but also speaks to our deep love of ensuring everyone has equality of opportunity and strong public services. Equality of opportunity, very Tory friendly, but public services, very Labour friendly. When we're talking about the environment, that was something that was coming up in both, but also critically was the top issue that when I was talking to young people who disproportionately vote Labour at the moment, that was the #1 issue that was coming up for them. And this is a constituency of voters that we totally lost it over coalition. We need to win them back, and we show that by being passionate about the things that they care about, and the environment is the top of that agenda. And that economy part, the third part, protecting young people through this coronavirus crash, tackling inequality, we covered this in a question earlier. These kinds of approaches, by the way, when you map them onto both Labour and Tory moderate voters, are popular positions. So I've thought very deeply about this, and the positions that I have come to is always about finding where is that maximizing middle ground where you can pull from both sides. And if you combine that with strong Liberal Democrat armies on the ground, you know, really invest in our campaigners, invest in our resourcing on the ground, translate those broad messages into something that's really tangible for someone who's not, you knock on their door and they're busy and, you know, what does it mean to vote Lib Dem? Why should I vote for you? It's tangible. That's what the local campaigners are really good at. You have a synergy between the two and you can win votes from both sides. And that's why I've picked the stance that I have in terms of the strategy of message.
Okay. Something that you've looked at and dealt with already is to do with Israel. Again, it's the question, the way the federal board adopted both the anti-Semitism definition and Islamophobia definition without really a party getting into a discussion, debate, or going to conference or deciding on it. And it left fair amount of disgruntlement amongst party members on both of those, and the way they were presented, where they were accepted, where certain parties took it on as a champion, where others started to qualify. You know, there's been a right mess. My simple question to you is, when there's something like that that affects people so emotionally, should federal board be the position to make a decision, or should it be the conference where an open discussion should be done on issues which are so widely emotional?
Well, my view is that when you create decisions like that, especially if they're emotional, when something gets heated, you have two options, right? The one is, you know, someone's just going to take a decision and everyone else lump it, or you try and build consensus. Yeah. Now, but think, as much as I hate coronavirus, I'm sure you all hate it too. We've had enough. Second wave is potentially coming. It's not going away anytime soon. But the one positive legacy, I hope, is the fact that we can speak online like this. There is no reason anymore why big decisions like that or anything else, if we needed to have a consultation process with the wider party, couldn't be done in a way that's really meaningful. I mean, not a sort of superficial tick in the box, right here what your favorite policy is going to be, but actually a meaningful discussion can be happening now over Zoom or whatever it is. And I do think that there needs to be a change of culture in the party, because for too long, and this has been my experience, and Nasser and I go way back, for those who don't know, when I very first stood as a parliamentary candidate in 2010. And since then, frankly, our own democracy in the party, I think, has been eroded. I think there used to be much more grassroots advocacy. Perhaps it's the way the world has changed. Perhaps it was because we went into government and it became much more about a small number of people at the top making decisions and everyone else just had to lump it because they didn't understand the politics. Enough. What I represent in this contest is a chance to go back, in a sense, to how we used to be, where we were much more consultative, where we absolutely believed in our own members' ability to understand the nuance and come together around consensus. And we can do that using these online platforms. And that's the broad principle of what I want to achieve. I will just point out that in the general election review, and I think it's right to say that as leader, one of the ways we've gone wrong is to have too much of a presidential leader, and that it has to be done in collaboration with particularly the CEO and the president, but also the wider party. And that speaks right back to what I was saying in terms of my leadership style. Let's bring people together with us.
Right. I've got 10 minutes left and I'm still struggling to get as many questions through because I've still got a long list and I've cut out 30 minutes of questions, so you forgive me for that. We talked about representation within the party. Some members send me experience of Bath. I know for years there's been experience in other parties up north. Huge amount, open racism, segregation of membership in a way, and very low representation of black members within the party, and resentment, which follows that the procedures are at the national level can be slow in the complaint process, etc. And it's you will have heard of things which I've heard of things for years, so it's been highlighted. What do you think? I mean, acknowledging what's happened, I mean, it's one thing, but what can we do to change that kind of tolerance of racism in local party? Because it has tolerated in the past.
Yeah, no, it has to be, we have to take, in my view, Nasser, and I know the examples that you're talking about, and I know of others as well. And do you know what? It still happens.
Yeah.
It still happens. And not just it still happens, it happens as plain as day. Yeah. And we are seeing it as we speak with selections that are ongoing. And because I am generally tried to be very open and helping other candidates, I've specifically tried to go out of my way to help candidates who have a similar lived experience to me. So not just women, but also people from diverse backgrounds. And I give them my campaign materials and I give them encouragement and I say, don't listen to them, you know. But what this comes down to is an inbuilt, as you say, segregation and racism that exists in our party. And I think step one is for us to admit it, because we don't. And the reason we don't is because we are liberals, right? So we fight against racism. How could we possibly have it in our own party? It doesn't compute, but it's here every day. And you just have to listen to Black and minority ethnic members of our own community telling us it's happening to them all the time. Microaggressions at selection questions. People saying, oh, an electorate would never elect a Black man here. There is no way that we could possibly. I mean, if that was true, then how do you explain the number of Black conservative MPs serving some of the whitest parts of the country? That is clearly not true. Empirically speaking, it's not true. And yet in our own party, it seems to be an excuse for why we can't make progress. And bluntly, Nasser, I've had enough. I've had enough. I think it does come down to, I've spoke about training. I think a complaints process is very important. That has been revamped recently. I very much hope that is going to start to get better. We know it's under-resourced, so I draw your attention to the question I answered earlier about resourcing. That is an area that's very important. But I also think we need to be looking at positive discrimination as well. I've spoken about something we could do immediately is to institute what they call a Rooney rule. So to have at least a protected number of places in every shortlist, particularly for target seats, but actually across the board. I think we also need to be looking at our council base, by the way. But to have that as a first step. And yes, we need to campaign to change the Equality Act so that if we wanted to have shortlists that were exclusively of people from diverse backgrounds, that we should be allowed to do that. But for now, I'm a very practical person. I want to introduce as much as I can as quickly as possible. And I think there is appetite in the party to do it. But it all starts from us all recognizing that we are institutionally racist too. And it's very difficult for us to admit that, but that's where we begin. And if we don't admit it, then we won't make progress.
Great. I'm sure there's a number of members here who will be very happy to hear that. You mentioned resourcing. There's a particular question, resourcing. You mentioned in the passing that there are groups, Black and BMA groups, etc., who feel that there is no resources allocated for a long time to actually promote membership, to develop members, and so forth. And I hope when you mean resources, you will look at it broader. In terms of in all aspects of developing representation and organizations that try to do something that perhaps can't achieve things if there's no resources.
Yeah, absolutely. And resources, I think it's not just about hiring an extra person in HQ. I also think, and in the same way that the party has got a bit better at this in the last few years, for example, outsourcing a lot of its training to ALGC, you know, look around the party at what is doing best practice and then resource them. It doesn't all have to be from the same people at HQ who are already pulled in so many different directions. And I would love to see specific funds. And some people have suggested, and I do very much like this idea, you know, money that has come in from donors whose families, for example, in the past, or businesses that they work for have, you know, links to colonial ties, you know, earmarking some of that money specifically for projects like this. In terms of the specific projects, I personally think that should be something that we collectively are doing together. Which are the ones that we want to promote over others? Unlikely that you'll be able to do all in the same time. But the other thing we need, Nasser, is a strategy. There isn't a strategy right now. There's a lot of people saying things need to change, but we now need to get to the point where we have a joined up strategy for increasing our representation at every single level of the party. And that includes membership, that includes councillors. By the way, councillors, I'll come back, is one of the poorest areas in terms of representation that we have as a party. Even our parliamentary party is better than that now. We can't just ride on our laurels and say, oh, you know, we've had a few candidates who were in decent positions over the past, and then you count me and Munira and job's done. No, 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 no. That is just the tip of the iceberg, and it all starts with spreading best practice wherever we see it. So if there are groups who want more money and want time and want advice, perhaps by having drafting motions to conference that are passed through experts who sit on the Federal Conference Committee, so that there's a better chance that they're debated on the floor. All of those things, I think we need to now be targeting our resources in a way that will really make a difference.
The last quick yes/no question is that, do you think Britain should have a calendar to reflect its multicultural society, where you've got Muslims, Hindus, you know, Jews, etc., who have very important days, just like Christmas is? Do you think there should be a calendar with allocating holidays to them?
Yeah, thank you, Nasser. I've always wanted that. I used to work in international schools. We'd have 70 different students from 70 different countries represented among our students, and we would celebrate each one with gusto. I actually don't think we even do that as a party, let alone as a country. And my own view, and even though my side of the family that is Palestinian is Greek Orthodox, I mean, bluntly, I don't think that there should be this artificial divide between Christianity being better and other faiths not being as good. Do you remember when David Cameron said, "We are a Christian country"? I personally found that really offensive, even though technically I come from a Christian background, because actually I think there is beauty in the diversity that we have in our country, and it should be equally celebrated. And I think that would be absolutely wonderful as a suggestion. We should also, by the way, make it something that is unequivocally allowed, that if you need to take time off work in order to celebrate a holiday or time off school, that you shouldn't be penalized in any way for it. And we see this in schools all the time. You know, when there are secondary school kids who have to take time out for Eid or Passover or whatever it was, and then it counts towards the number of days that they are marked as absent from the school. And it's far more likely at that point that those families are then fined. Because of government guidance. There is injustice in the system at every level, and at least let's start to change that kind of injustice first. But I love the idea of a change of calendar.
Well, thank you very much, Layla. We're on to 4 o'clock, and I know you've got to go, but instead of asking you to say concluding words, because I think you've covered it quite well, can I just ask the chair of Kashmir, first of all, and also the Kashmir group, as well as the Black Lives Matter, Juliet, to say a few words, not ask a question, but just to say a few words if they have of concerns. So Mahmoud, would you like to go first? Right, he's just unmuting himself. Amin, is he unmuted?
Not yet.
Is Mahmoud still there?
He's still there, but he hasn't unmuted.
Yes, Nancy, I'm unmuted now.
Okay. Would you like to give a few comments?
Thank you very much for coming on and talk to all of us. And it's been an absolute pleasure seeing you and having a discussion with you. Besides being the chair of Liberal Friends of Kashmir, I also hold the qualification of being educated by MC International. And on Kashmir, there are 30 articles on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. India has broken 19 of the 30 articles. That's first. I think we need to look at a second one. I said it's not a question. Second one is that there are pockets of Kashmiri community all across the UK. And Labour has been very good by capturing their vote. And I think we as a party need to be active and not wait for them to reach out to us. We as a party, we need to reach out to them and hold events, finance, and put everything in place so that we can capture this. And I have seen this since the Iraq War, what a pivotal moment made it do. A lot of folks that was a Kashmiri vote, believe it or not. Someone who's worked on this since 1980 knows this. And I think we need to do that. And I think when whoever's elected leader would engage with communities of diversity and work forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Juliet, would you like to say a few words?
I think she might have dropped off.
Yes, she's dropped off.
Okay.
Okay. Not to worry. Not to worry. Well, back to you. And apart from saying thank you, obviously, I'd like to wish you all the best in your remaining 2 weeks of hustings. You will see some of us there tomorrow, Layla, posing some other questions. And we hope that whoever wins, the groups shall indeed work together and try and improve and bring about an agenda for equalities within the party and within the country.
Completely agree. Thank you so much, all of you, for your time. It's been a real pleasure. And I look forward to seeing some of you tomorrow.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Fantastic. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, Layla. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.